In 1493 BCE, a trained Egyptian physician sat down and wrote a prescription, not for a fever, not for a wound, for a woman who did not want to become pregnant. The remedy called for crocodile dung, mixed with honey, shaped into a small plug, and inserted before intercourse. That was the state of the art. 4,000 years ago, in the most medically advanced civilization on Earth, that was the best answer science had to offer. Most people hear that and laugh, and then they assume the story ends there. Ancient people did something ridiculous, and then modern medicine arrived and fixed everything in the 1960s. But that version skips 4,000 years. It skips the plant the Romans loved so much they drove it to extinction. It skips the medieval midwives who memorized herb dosages and risked being burned alive to share them. It skips the man who carved a lemon in half and accidentally invented the diaphragm. It skips the woman who went to jail for opening a clinic, and the women in a Puerto Rican housing project who swallowed experimental pills they did not fully understand so the rest of the world could benefit from what was learned. This is not a story about science eventually saving the day. It is a story about 4,000 years of women solving a problem that the world around them either ignored, suppressed, or actively made illegal, and it is stranger, darker, and more important than anything you learned in school. Stay with us. The ancient world, crocodile dung, and the plant that went extinct. The Egyptian prescription was not folk superstition scribbled in the margins of some obscure text. It came from the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most sophisticated medical documents ever discovered, written by trained physicians for other trained physicians. And here is the part that surprises people. Modern researchers think the acidity of crocodile dung may have actually created a mildly spermicidal environment. The Egyptians were not as far off as they seemed, but crocodile dung was not the only tool in the Egyptian physician's kit. Egyptian women also used pessaries made from acacia tips mixed with honey and ground dates. Acacia ferments into lactic acid, which is, as it happens, the active ingredient in several modern spermicidal products. They experimented with lint soaked in fermented plant matter, creating crude but surprisingly logical barrier methods. These women were not guessing, they were iterating, testing, passing knowledge from one generation to the next inside a culture that, compared to what came later in European history, was relatively open about the idea that women might want to control their own fertility. That openness did not last. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans had their own contraceptive obsession, and it centered on a single plant. If you have never heard of silphium, that is because it no longer exists. The Romans used it so aggressively they wiped it off the face of the earth. Silphium grew wild in a narrow coastal strip near the city of Cyrene in what is now Libya. It was a fennel-like plant, and the resin extracted from it was believed to be a powerful contraceptive. Roman women would dissolve a small amount in water and drink it once a month. Ancient sources describe it as remarkably effective. How valuable was silphium? Valuable enough that the city of Cyrene put it on their coins. Julius Caesar reportedly kept over 1,500 pounds of the resin in Rome's official treasury. Not gold, not silver, a contraceptive plant. But here is the problem with a miracle plant that only grows in one small region. Everyone wants it, nobody manages the supply. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Pliny the Elder wrote that silphium had become so rare that a single stalk was worth its weight in silver. Within a generation, it was gone entirely. Some historians consider it the first recorded case of a species driven to extinction by human demand. The Romans moved on to pomegranate rinds, olive oil, cedar resin, and a collection of amulets that historians politely categorize as magical thinking. Nothing replaced silphium, and with it vanished one of the ancient world's most effective contraceptive tools, centuries before anyone would find anything comparable. The medieval period, knowledge that could get you killed. What replaced the Egyptian pessaries and Roman plants was not better science, It was silence. As Christianity spread across Europe and the institutional church consolidated power over medical practice, contraception became increasingly associated with sin. The knowledge did not disappear. It went underground. For roughly 1,000 years, the most reliable contraceptive knowledge in Europe lived in the memories of women who never wrote it down. Midwives, herbalists, village healers. They knew which plants could prevent pregnancy, which could end one, and which would kill you if you got the dose wrong. Pennyroyal, tansy, rue, Queen Anne's lace seeds. These were the tools of a shadow pharmacology, traded in whispers between mothers and daughters, between neighbors, between women who understood that this knowledge could get them accused of witchcraft. Pennyroyal is a bitter mint that, brewed into a strong tea, can induce contractions and terminate an early pregnancy. It was widely documented in herbalist manuals and passed along orally in communities where written literacy was rare. The problem is that pennyroyal is also a liver toxin. The distance between the dose that ends a pregnancy and the dose that ends a life is terrifyingly small. Women died from it regularly. They took it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, was used differently. Women chewed the seeds after intercourse. Some modern studies suggest the seeds contain compounds that interfere with progesterone. Whether it worked reliably is debated. That women kept using it for centuries tells you everything about how desperately the knowledge was needed. What is remarkable about this period is not the methods themselves, it is the transmission. For hundreds of years, without textbooks, without institutional support, and under direct threat from religious and civil authorities, women maintained a functioning oral tradition of reproductive medicine. That tradition survived because individual women decided the risk of sharing it was worth taking. The 18th century, a Venetian adventurer and a piece of fruit. By the 1700s, European contraception had entered its improvisational era. Condoms made from animal intestines appeared in London and Paris, tied at the base with ribbon. They were expensive, unreliable, and marketed primarily to men as protection against syphilis rather than pregnancy. Women, as usual, were left to figure things out independently. Which brings us to one of history's more colorful contributors, Giacomo Casanova, the Venetian adventurer whose memoirs read like a one-man encyclopedia of 18th century excess, documented a method he apparently used with some regularity. He would take a lemon, hollow out one half, and place it over his partner's cervix before intercourse. The citric acid, he reasoned, would act as a spermicide. The rind would act as a physical barrier. He was not entirely wrong. The citric acid in lemon juice does have spermicidal properties. The hollowed rind functions as a crude cervical cap. Modern reproductive historians have noted that Casanova essentially invented a prototype of the diaphragm using fruit. Whether his partners appreciated the innovation is not recorded. The Enlightenment advanced astronomy, physics, and political philosophy. It did remarkably little for women who did not want to be pregnant. And then the 19th century arrived and made things actively worse. The Comstock Act, when information became a crime. In 1873, the United States Congress passed a law that made it a federal crime to send any information about contraception through the postal system. History knows it as the Comstock Act, named after Anthony Comstock, the postal inspector and moral crusader who lobbied for it and then spent decades enforcing it with genuine enthusiasm. Books, pamphlets, advertisements, even private letters between a doctor and a patient. If it mentioned birth control and it went through the mail, it was illegal. Violations carried fines of up to $5,000 and prison sentences of up to 5 years. Comstock personally boasted of destroying over 160 tons of what he called obscene literature during his career. The practical effect was devastating. Doctors could not advise their patients. Pharmacists could not stock contraceptive supplies openly. Women who had previously accessed information through printed pamphlets were cut off entirely. The law did not reduce the demand for contraception, it just made accessing it dangerous. Women in wealthy families could still find sympathetic private physicians. Women without money or connections had nothing. For 40 years, that was the landscape in America. A federal law that treated information about a woman's own body as equivalent to pornography. Then Margaret Sanger arrived, and the entire fight shifted. Sanger is a complicated figure, and anyone telling this story honestly has to acknowledge that up front, she held eugenicist views that are rightly condemned. She aligned herself with movements that advocated for selective breeding and targeted marginalized communities. That history is documented and it matters. But it was also Sanger who, working as a nurse in the immigrant tenements of New York's Lower East Side, watched women die from self-induced abortions and back-alley procedures because they had no access to contraception. And it was Sanger who decided that had to change. In 1914, she launched a newsletter that included information about contraception. She was charged with violating the Comstock Act and fled to Europe to avoid trial. While there, she studied the diaphragm methods being used in Dutch birth control clinics. She smuggled diaphragms back into the United States inside packages of goods. In October 1916, Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in America in Brooklyn. It operated for 9 days. In those 9 days, nearly 500 women came through the doors. On the 10th day, an undercover police officer posing as a patient reported the clinic. Sanger was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 30 days in a workhouse. The arrest made national headlines. Sanger spent the next 2 decades building organizations, raising funds, and fighting legal battles that slowly, case by case, chipped away at the Comstock restrictions. And she spent years searching for what she called a magic pill, a simple, reliable contraceptive that any woman could take without needing a doctor's fitting or a partner's cooperation. By the late 1940s, she had found her scientist. The pill, a Puerto Rican housing project, and an unanswered question. Gregory Pincus was a reproductive biologist who had been largely frozen out of mainstream academia. He was brilliant, ambitious, and available. When Sanger approached him about developing an oral contraceptive, he was interested but had no funding. That problem was solved by Catherine Dexter McCormick, an MIT-educated biologist and heir to a vast industrial fortune who was in her 70s, had spent decades advocating for women's suffrage and had the money to fund an entire research program out of her own pocket. Over the course of the 1950s, she personally financed Pincus's laboratory at a scale that no government agency or pharmaceutical company was willing to match. Pincus developed a synthetic form of progesterone that suppressed ovulation when taken daily. The science worked, but large-scale human trials in 1950s America were legally and socially almost impossible. The Comstock Act's remnants were still on the books in many states. Hospitals and universities would not touch it. The Catholic Church opposed it vocally, so the researchers looked elsewhere. In 1956, large-scale clinical trials for the pill began in Puerto Rico. The location was not random. Puerto Rico had no anti-contraception laws. It had an existing network of birth control clinics, and it had a large population of low-income women in public housing projects, who researchers believed would be easy to recruit. Women in the Rio Piedras housing project were given the pill and monitored for side effects. Many reported severe reactions, nausea, headaches, dizziness, blood clots. The lead investigator on the island reported to Pincus that the pill caused too many side effects to be acceptable. Pincus overruled her assessment. The trial continued. 3 women died during the course of the Puerto Rico trials. No autopsies were performed to determine whether the experimental drug was a contributing factor. Many of the women had not been given full informed consent about the experimental nature of what they were taking. Some believed they were receiving standard medical treatment. By modern standards of medical ethics, the Puerto Rico trials would be unacceptable. By the standards of the 1950s, when poor women of color were routinely treated as expendable test subjects, they barely registered as controversial. The data was submitted to the FDA. On June 23, 1960, Enovid became the first oral contraceptive approved for use in the United States. Even the approval was handled carefully. Enovid was initially marketed not as a contraceptive, but as a treatment for menstrual disorders. The label noted, almost as an aside, that the drug had a side effect of preventing pregnancy. Doctors understood the code. Within 2 years, over 1.2 million American women were taking the pill. By 1965, that number had reached 6.5 million. The cultural impact was seismic. For the first time in human history, a woman could reliably control her own fertility with a daily tablet that did not require her partner's knowledge, cooperation, or consent. But there was a catch. In 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that married couples had a constitutional right to use contraception. Married couples. If you were an unmarried woman in America in 1966, your legal right to access the pill depended entirely on what state you lived in. It took another 7 years. In 1972, the Supreme Court finally ruled that the right to contraception could not be limited to married individuals. For the first time, every adult woman in America, regardless of whether she had a husband, could legally obtain it. Think about that timeline. The FDA approved the pill in 1960. Unmarried women did not gain guaranteed legal access until 1972. For 12 years, whether you could control your own fertility depended on whether you wore a wedding ring. 4,000 years. That is how long this story stretches. From a physician in ancient Egypt carefully recording a recipe involving crocodile dung and honey, to a woman in 1972 finally being told by the highest court in her country that yes, she could decide for herself when to become a mother. Every chapter involved women solving a problem that the institutions around them refused to solve or actively made worse. Egyptian physicians iterated with acacia and lactic acid. Roman women relied on a plant until there were no plants left. Medieval midwives memorized herb dosages and risked execution to share them. A Venetian adventurer carved a lemon in half. Margaret Sanger went to jail. Catherine McCormick wrote the checks. And unnamed women in a Puerto Rican housing project swallowed pills they did not fully understand so that the rest of the world could benefit from what was learned. The pill did not appear out of nowhere. It arrived at the end of a 4,000-year chain of knowledge, sacrifice, and stubbornness. Every woman who ever ground a root, brewed a tea, or whispered a secret to her daughter was part of that chain. That is the history they do not put on the label. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We cover stories like this every week, the ones that got left out of the textbooks and deserve to be told. We will see you in the next one.